Ecuador, Turkey, Indonesia. These three countries experienced magnitude 6 plus earthquakes within the period of April 22 to April 25, 2025. The outcomes of these earthquakes are dissimilar. For Turkey, the region of Istanbul would have expressed persons experiencing injuries. A BBC report speaks of a minimum of 151 persons injured. Ecuador, the Reuters uh, article reported 20 persons injured. Indonesia, there was no report of injury. So here's an overview as it pertains to what the tectonics or the seismotectonics reveal. For Turkey, the region or the epicenter would have been more so within the sea. The sea had a closer location to Istanbul. Looking at the Google terrain map, we can see whereby it is a region of a relatively long fault line. It could be argued or interpreted that this is a strike slip fault zone. The earthquake is expressed as a shallow earthquake. Um, Now, looking at some things relating to the overall geomorphology of the area of Istanbul, we can see where the location is relatively flat terrain, folded strata, and there exists high levels of drainage. Combining these physical geography factors, in addition to the relatively high population density of Istanbul, it gives explanation into why the intensity map for Turkey is much greater than those of Ecuador and Indonesia. Similarly, it gives explanation into why this region would have experienced a higher number of injuries relative to both Ecuador and Indonesia. For Ecuador, we can see that the epicenter is pretty much along the coastline. Now, similar to the Turkey earthquake, Ecuador's earthquake is considered as a shallow earthquake. This can be attributed to a strike slip motion, even though there does exist that subduction zone along further out of the away from the coastline of Ecuador itself. Now, when we speak about the shaking itself, looking at the shake map on the left, we can see that the spread of the intensity is not as great relative to what we would have seen for Turkey. And this can be attributed to the fact that Ecuador, within this region, has a greater density of high-rise land or high-rise landscapes. Sorry, so we're talking about hilly terrain, mountains, and these high-rise landscapes give the way for the dissipation of energy. In other words, attenuation. It's a case where it's not really concentrated or increasing the intensity of shaking, it's actually absorbing it. So in that respect, that gives the explanation from the physical geography point of view as to why more than likely there would have been a lesser number of persons injured. In addition to that, the population density within the region of the epicenter itself is not that great as well. So that too, from the human side, is another factor behind why there is a significantly less number of persons reportedly injured. For Indonesia, what the seismotectonics reveal is that one, this earthquake is a deep one. Um, it basically took place pretty much along or within the subduction zone, uh, further out into the Pacific Ocean itself. Now, what it is that we can also see is that the intensity is relatively light. Now, Unlike both Istanbul and Ecuador earthquakes, the bulk of attenuation for this case is predominantly from the seafloor. So if you even look at that map on the left, looking at that satellite map, you should be able to see that the seafloor is not a flat surface. It's highly irregular, and that represents, the change in terms of elevation. You have areas of ridges, etc. So just the same as the fact that the mountains on the surface will basically absorb the energy is just the same for the seafloor. And considering that this is also a highly deep earthquake, it means therefore it has to travel much farther in terms of the energy to reach the surface. So these factors, you know, distance and the physical geography of the seafloor itself limits the amount of energy that can actually be felt by the nearby population. So to summarize, Turkey, Ecuador, and Indonesia experienced magnitude 6 plus earthquakes. However, distance, physical geography, whether it be a case that it is flat terrain or much more rugged terrain, population density, as well as basically talking about the moisture of the land itself. These factors and others contribute to intensity, and in addition to that, basically can give us greater insight as it relates to why a particular region will experience a higher number of injuries and casualties relative to others.